What lessons can America learn from the protests taking place in China against the regime's anti COVID measures? Join Richard Ebeling and me in this week's Libertarian Angle as we examine that question. Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and this is this week's Libertarian Angle. The show that you all know brings you the principled case for the libertarian philosophy, which is what FFF has done for some 33 years. As you all know, this is our end-of-year fundraising time. I hope you'll keep us in your giving considerations. You all help us get through the coming year, and you've kept us going for 33 years, and I hope we've merited your continued support for advancing a free society. I'm joined as I am every week by Richard Ebeling, who was actually Vice President of Academic Affairs when FFF got established back in 1989. Richard, good to see you again. You don't look any different than you did back then.
Thank you. You sort of look the same. Oh, no. Absolutely the same.
Oh, thank you.
You looked as old then as you look now.
Oh, thank you very much. You sound like Biden trying to buy my vote. All right, Richard, let's begin this week's show with talking about what's going on in China, because I think that has some valuable lessons and there's some humor involved in it too. So the Chinese have their own COVID crackdown, dealing with mandates, mandatory vaccinations and mandatory lockdowns and mandatory everything, mask requirements and so forth. I mean, they're a totalitarian society, why not? They have the power to do so. But there's been this huge reaction among the Chinese people, especially young people that look around the world, happen to catch like the World Cup and notice that nobody's wearing masks and so forth. And so they've had this series of spontaneous protests, which the Chinese authorities, not surprisingly, are cracking down with their customary fierceness and ferocity, killing people, suppressing the protests, putting up walls and fences and keeping track of them, monitoring them. I read one article talking about the security state in China, monitoring what people are doing, what they're talking about, what their emails are saying, rounding up people, contacting people to come in. I mean, this is a kind of like a valuable lesson as to what living in a national security state is all about when the full powers of the national security state are being inflicted on the citizenry. But one of the humorous parts about this, if we can find some humor in it, is the reaction of U.S. officials, including the Biden administration. They're over there lecturing China on the principles of free speech, and that these protesters have a right to protest. And it's time for the Chinese regime to recognize that and let them go ahead and protest. But what's funny about this is that the Biden administration is not objecting at all to the healthcare measures that the Chinese regime is imposing and that what these young people are protesting against. In other words, the lockdowns, the mask mandates, the vaccine requirements that are all part of this totalitarian communist system, the Biden administration and U.S. officials they have their lips sealed. Why? Because it's the same thing they do over here and that they have done over here. But over here, you see, it's part of freedom. When the U.S. has mandates and lockdowns, it's part of America's free enterprise system. But when the Chinese regime does it, oh, well, we're going to stay quiet about it. So they'll object to the fact that these people are not allowed to protest against these things, but they are in full agreement with what the Chinese regime is doing, that the Chinese people are protesting against. What do you think?
Well, back in the spring of 2020, when the whole COVID crisis first emerged, I wrote an article for FFF on the conquest of the United States by China. Now, this was a play off a title of a famous essay by the classical liberal laissez-faire sociologist of the early 20th century, William Graham Sumner. when right after the Spanish-American War and the United States was annexing Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands, and especially establishing a colonial empire in the Far East by transferring from Spanish control to US control the Philippines. He was saying that the United States fought Spain in the name of freeing Cuba from a colonial power, and then Spain conquers us by making America an imperialist power by the US taking over the Spanish Empire in these ways. Well, the reason I did the conquest of the United States by China is that, in fact, this is what the US did. These lockdowns, these shutdowns, these commands to not leave your apartment, to be surveillanced, to wear a mask, don't go to work, don't produce, don't go near another human being. This was China's policy. That's where they started. And what did the United States and all of our European friends, what did they do? They introduced the same policy. We basically adapted the totalitarian Chinese communist model of dealing with a virus. Basically the entire denial, the prohibition of all types of personal freedom, the freedom to choose your degree of safety, whether you felt that you needed to be vaccinated, whether you were going to show degrees of responsibility and expected from others in the free arena of civil society in terms of not spreading germs or not getting too close to those who you might think would be more susceptible, such as your Aunt Minnie, who was getting on in years. Instead, rather than relying upon these private sector and private medical avenues to deal with the symptoms and the spreading of the diseases, we decided to follow the totalitarian model. Now, we, because of political pressure, started easing out of it in the second half of 2020, though certainly not completely, and still now not. But the Chinese have followed their own model unswervingly for 3 years now. Every time someone sneezes, and I know I'm slightly exaggerating, but every time someone sneezes anywhere in China, it's presumed that this is now the threat of a new flare-up of the virus. An entire districts in towns, entire cities, entire regions of tens of millions of people are locked down and shut down. Barriers are put around the exits to high-rise apartment buildings. The people can't go shopping for food or ordinary medical supplies that they might have prescriptions for, having nothing to do with the virus. And it has destroyed various parts of the Chinese economy. It has slowed down their rate of growth. Chinese youth now are experiencing the highest rate of unemployment since any of these reforms were begun to be introduced in the 1990s. Youth unemployment now is somewhere between 18 to 20% of that segment of the labor force. And there's finally a revolt against these very types of policies that China introduced and the West, including the United States, followed. But what is interesting in this, and I know your point, the United States is not objecting to that, but what is interesting in this is that while the protests began as a resentment and a resistance and an opposition to the COVID controls, all the media, mainstream press, either press more conservative libertarian or even some of the more left press, what have they all tended to highlight? Well, the protests have expanded from that into a general argument about the importance of freedom. So people shouting or holding banners up, down with Xi Jinping, Communist Party step down, freedom, rule of law, democracy, meaning representative government, not a one-party dictatorship, personal liberty. So that in fact, the stranglehold and the resentments and anger and depressions caused by this totalitarian restrictions on human movement and activity has blossomed among certain of these protesters in a general appeal for an end to all oppression and the movement towards systems of freedom. So we should be hailing that. And in fact, we should be calling for the same things here in America. If we're going to copy the Chinese again, let's copy the mindset of the protesters and say, let my people go, Mr. Biden, let my people go. End the restrictions that the Chinese people are calling for the abolition of.
Yeah, but here's the quandary, Richard. I mean, all these Chinese people that are, notice what they're protesting against. Did you see any of those kind of protests over here in the United States? I mean, it seems to me that all the little serfs over here were relishing these controls and these restrictions. The only ones that I could tell that were protesting against them were libertarians.
Yes.
But everybody else is, oh, thank you for taking care of us. Thank you for doing these things, which is kind of weird to see, Chinese people protesting against tyranny while the American people are over here. Thank you. Thank you for the tyranny that you're inflicting on us.
Yeah, if I can just say, one example of what you're talking about that stuck in my mind, and sometime in the second half of 2020 or in 2021, one of my articles for FFF's Future Freedom publication, I pointed out that there was a report that at some outdoor high school sports event, there was a large bleacher of parents watching the kids play. And the high school kids are on the field and parents are in the bleachers, and most of them are wearing masks. And far away on a far side of the bleacher, there was one parent who didn't have a mask on. And the police showed up and told her to put a mask on. And she said, I don't have a mask and I don't want to wear a mask. And I'm far away from everyone. I'm on the other side of the bleacher. They took her under arrest. And she was shouting to the other people in the bleachers, the other parents, the adults, help, help, this is not right. And what was shocking in the sense of the psychology of a society is that the news report said that everyone else just ignored what was happening to her and just quietly kept watching the kids playing on the field. A total indifference, a passivity, a lack of empathy for someone who's done nothing wrong, isn't sitting next to people, that 6 feet away nonsense, and is dragged away by the police for just not wanting to wear a mask while sitting far away by themselves. And everyone else, oh no, of course. Well, why is she doing this? So let's watch the kiddies play. I mean, that is the mentality that a totalitarian state wants to imbue in its subjects.
Oh, they love it. I mean, to me, that's the whole purpose of public schooling, government schooling, is to create the nice little subservient, compliant citizen that will not object when he sees his fellow citizen being carted away for violating some ridiculous regulation.
Yeah.
I mean, to me, these Chinese protesters, that kind of inspire me, Richard. I mean, they're risking their lives to get out there and take a stand. Over here, you're not risking your life to stand up against this tyrannical stuff. Okay, they may cart this lady away, but they're going to release her after a day or two.
Right.
There's no excuse that Americans have for not protesting, is my point. But I want to make another point, though I think is important, because there have been libertarians who have protested this, and I think they've been acting very heroically. But it seems to me that they focus a lot of their attention on really what amounts to mismanagement of the system. That they want the government to handle this better. That the government should have a free enterprise person in charge of the Centers for Disease Control. So you laugh, but I mean, we've seen it in other areas where a libertarian leaning conservative gets appointed to some regulatory commission, and oh boy, reform oriented libertarians get all happy and excited over it. In other words, this is a great opportunity we have for raising people's vision to a higher level, not to the fact that the government should better manage its healthcare controls or its healthcare system, but for separating healthcare in the state. This is a great opportunity for us to make the case to people. Look, government should have no role in religion. We all agree on that. It shouldn't have any role in economic activity. That was our heritage of economic liberty. But it shouldn't have any role in education. It shouldn't have any role in healthcare. That there should be a total separation of healthcare in the state. So when a pandemic happens like this, what would happen? Well, people then have to make decisions. Some people would go to the healthcare industry for guidance, and they do research. And so some physicians are saying, well, we recommend this vaccine. Others are saying, oh man, don't take the vaccine. Everybody's then free to make his own choices, educated decisions. A restaurant can decide whether it wants to have a mask requirement. If consumers don't like that mask requirement, they can go elsewhere. Or so there's a harmony that develops within the context of facing this pandemic, which is a natural phenomenon. You know, what expertise does a politician or a bureaucrat have when it comes to healthcare? And no more expertise than it does when it comes to religion. And so what we ought to be fighting for and using this as an opportunity for is not just to get a better managed healthcare system on the part of the government or better people in public office to manage this in a way that is satisfactory to libertarians. Where we really see this as an opportunity, or should see it as an opportunity to make the case for getting government entirely out of healthcare, a total separation of healthcare and the state, the same way our ancestors separated church and state.
Are you suggesting that people like Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer don't know what's right for you and healthcare?
Well, I think that's exactly what I'm suggesting.
I am shocked. Boy, they're the people's representative. And if the people choose them, they must know what's right to tell all of us how to live and what to do. Isn't that what democracy is all about?
That's true. And they should be telling us what we can read, because, you know, reading what we read can be just as damaging as that pandemic. I mean, dangerous ideas.
But let me send a text to Nancy right now and find out what she thinks we should be talking about on this show. I'm sure it'd be the right thing. No, the fact is that we presume, and of course this plays into the rationales and the justifications of the power and budgets of those in the bureaucracy and the political establishment, that somehow they are the experts. They have the knowledge, wisdom, and with the proper political authority, the ability to know how our lives should be guided and structured and filled, whether it be the wages we earn, the safety of the products that they decide we can purchase and use, including how to best manage our health care and our health needs. I mean, if you want to see what government socialized medicine is like, one just has to look at the veterans hospitals in the United States. How many decades has it become notorious on the inefficiency, the corruption, the lack of careful medical attention to the patients that they deal with? These are veterans who are being paid for by the government in hospitals that are owned and with everything from doctors to nurses to support staff paid for by the government. This is the socialist medicine par excellence. And every so often the media, in the mainstream or not, will sort of do an expose of some episodes of this. And this shows what competency, what positive incentives to try to do the right thing for the customer, like in the marketplace, do those in these positions of power and decision making have? They have nothing. It's not in their interest. It's not in their bailiwick of knowledge and experience. And there's no payoff in the same way that if a physician is operating in the market, his brand name reputation, his stream of income, the confidence of him in the eyes of his patients all depend upon him doing the best he can, or losing his patients and being driven out of business, just like anyone else in the marketplace. But with government salaries and government budgets and government guarantees, you pervert the incentives and the capacity for care and attention to those whose well-being is your niche in the market-based division of labor. So to put these in their hands is not only wrong, it's a dangerous and harmful path to follow for the actual health needs of the population.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. I mean, I'm glad you focus in on the central planning aspect of this, because that's really what we have is central planning. And that's what Ludwig von Mises called planned chaos. I mean, what better term to describe what's going on in American healthcare? And notice, Richard, that you make light of the fact about Pelosi and Schumer and Biden and so forth, but they really are convinced that they know what's best for us. They think that they're the experts, along with Fauci or whatever, to decide what's best for us. That's where the lockdowns come in, and the mandates and so forth. It's the same mindset. I think that we really need to emphasize this in Red China. That's exactly how the Chinese officials, this commonality of mindset among the central planners here in the federal government and the central planners in China. Now, in China, it seems that in response to the protests, the Chinese authorities might be backing off a little bit in order to satisfy people. Okay, maybe fewer mandates or fewer requirements here. But notice, though, and maybe the protesters will be satisfied with that. But notice, though, that even though they back off, the government remains in charge of the healthcare system. They promise that they're going to do a better job. They're going to manage it better. And the protesters who don't know any better, most likely, okay, well, if they manage it better, that's what we wanted to see. Well, it's the same thing over here. That if all we do is complain about the mandates and the government backs off both the state and the federal level and has fewer mandates the next time this happens, or fewer mask requirements and so forth, the idea is going to be, see, they're doing a better job. Our protests really did help. That is not freedom. Freedom is not having better central planning or more lenient central planning. Freedom is getting government out of this area completely, where people are free to manage their own lives. When a hurricane comes, when a tornado comes, when a pandemic comes, that leave government out of these things the same way we leave government out of religion.
Yeah, the schizophrenia that I was remembering a parallel that sort of struck me is that during the old Soviet days, you'd have news correspondents headquartered and operating in Moscow, the New York Times, the Washington Post, et cetera, et cetera. And they would write their articles, and sometimes when their tour finished, they'd come back and write a book, about their experience in the Soviet Union as a reporter and what they saw and the nature of the system. And sometimes they'd be unbelievably biting and insightful and devastating in their criticisms of everything from the lack of personal freedom or the bankruptcy of a planned economy. And then these same correspondents would come back to America, now working on the domestic news beat. Oh, we need more redistribution. Oh, the business doesn't have enough regulation. Oh, there's not enough pursuit of social justice. And you wonder, what kind of schizophrenia do these people have, that they see the absurdities of it in others, where they were professionally watching, reporting on the beat. Yet when they come home, they're blind to the same institutional and ideological and psychological forces at work here as they were shocked by and negatively reported about over there.
Yeah. Well, I think another important thing here is to recognize is that just because you have the freedom to protest in a society doesn't mean you live in a free society. And that's where I think U.S. officials go off on this thing with China is if only you leave those protesters alone, that will mean that you live in a free society. No, I mean, you saw this in the run up to the Iraq War when Bush was thinking about invading Iraq, and there was massive protests against it. And at the end of the protests, he says, okay, we've had our free speech rights exercised. Now I order the invasion of Iraq. And the pro-Bush people were saying, well, see, yeah, we have free speech. We have free speech. Now let's all rally around the government, because the government had to make a tough decision regardless of what the protesters were saying. Well, it's the same thing here, that just because people have a right to protest against tyranny, if the tyranny continues, then obviously the protest, while it's important, it's an aspect of freedom, it hasn't brought about freedom because the protest failed to eliminate the tyranny. And I think a lot of the Chinese fail to recognize that. And clearly a lot of Americans fail to recognize it, that freedom entails not just the right to speak out against tyranny, it means ending the tyranny that is being protested against.
I think another element, and you were touching upon this in an earlier remark, in a way, you were saying, do the Chinese really understand all of the implications? And to the extent that many don't, we have to ask ourselves, why don't they? It's because the Chinese government understands, as all tyrannies do, the power of ideas, the impact of information. That's why they block and manipulate the internet. That's why they censor social media over there. They don't want people to know alternative ideas on politics, on economics, on civil society, on what is going on in other places in the world, or even being allowed to speak with other Chinese citizens about their experiences and frustrations and judgments about these things. Because once you open real free speech, it becomes a Pandora's box from the government's point of view, because who knows, they might eventually pull aside the curtain and say, look at the Wizard of Oz. He's not this giant on the screen. He's a little nobody pulling some levers behind the screen.
I'm really glad you brought that up. It's a nice way to wrap up the show because, we've been doing this for 33 years, Richard, and I know that people tend to get discouraged sometimes. They see things getting worse and worse over the years. But the fact is that you never know what can happen tomorrow. I mean, things can turn on a dime. And the Chinese experience proves this, that if ideas on liberty were not dangerous, this totalitarian regime in China wouldn't care about the protests. Why do they care? If they have, they obviously have omnipotent power. What are they worried about? They're worried about the fact that ideas on liberty can sweep across a land, can grip people's hearts and minds, and result in the overthrow of the regime. And that's why we continue doing what we're doing at FFF, not only because it's the right thing to do, but also because you never know what can happen tomorrow with the power of ideas on liberty.
Absolutely. And that's what makes the case for freedom in its various facets important, because it's the only way that we can change the system in positive and healthy and freedom and prosperity oriented ways.
Okay, well, that eloquent insight will wrap things up. Thank you again for tuning in. Thank you for your support of FFF. If you haven't yet made a donation, please do so. And we'll look forward to seeing you next week. And Richard, I look forward to seeing you next week.
Until next time.